The UN Security Council has passed a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza for the first time. The breakthrough comes after the United States abstained from the vote after vetoing previous efforts over the last 5 months. The resolution also demanded the immediate release of all hostages still being held by Hamas, the group that committed the October 7 terror attacks against Israel.
The draft resolution has been adopted as resolution.
Applause hailed a milestone moment at the United Nations Security Council. 14 nations voted in favour of the resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza for the first time. The United States refrained from vetoing the agreement, instead abstaining, directly opposing a request from Israel not to do so.
This resolution rightly acknowledges that during the month of Ramadan, we must recommit to peace. Hamas can do that by accepting the deal on the table. A ceasefire can begin immediately with the release of the first hostage. And so we must put pressure on Hamas to do just that.
Israel's planned invasion of Rafah is causing major concerns for the US, its biggest ally. An Israeli delegation was due to travel to Washington this week to discuss alternatives. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called off the trip after the Security Council's decision. And Israel's Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, already in the US, shows no signs of acknowledging the ceasefire call.
We have no moral right to stop the war in Gaza until we return all the hostages home. If we do not reach a clear and decisive decision in Gaza, it may bring us closer to war in the north.
In Gaza, the Security Council vote brought some hope to many.
This marks a crucial step towards halting Israel's actions. The U.S. must leverage all of its resources as it's both the primary and ultimate advocate for Israel.
While the ceasefire vote brought hope in Gaza, without Israel's support it may end up being a symbolic gesture rather than a practical solution for peace.
Now, Rosa Freedman is Professor of Law, Conflict and Global Development at the University of Reading in the UK. Her research focuses on the UN, especially questions related to human rights. And I asked her if she was surprised that today's ceasefire resolution passed.
I think most of us were surprised that the resolution was tabled in the first place. The United States had tabled the resolution on Friday, which did not pass and was vetoed by Russia and by China. And very swiftly, the 10 members of the Security Council who don't hold a veto, who are not permanent members, who are elected for 2-year terms, tabled this resolution, one of the shortest resolutions in the Security Council's history, which had 3 key messages. And the surprise was not that it passed, but that it was tabled so swiftly in the first place.
And why do you think the US didn't vote it down this time?
The 3 key messages are ones that have global recognition. There are maybe a few states that don't agree with 1 or 2 of them, but globally there is consensus that there needs to be a ceasefire, not a permanent one, but for a short period of time, a ceasefire during the holy month of Ramadan. There is global consensus that these hostages who have been held in captivity for nearly 170 days should be released, including the babies and also the elderly and the sick. And there is global consensus that the people in Gaza in this humanitarian catastrophe must receive aid, specifically food aid, to stop a famine. So this resolution had to pass because there wasn't a single country in the UN Security Council who could say that they didn't agree with those 3 key messages.
OK, so now it has passed. I understand that this is legally binding, but can Israel simply ignore this decision?
Well, it's legally binding, and a lot of what the UN does is legally binding, but the Security Council has these added extra enforcement powers. So it can send sanctions, embargoes, no-fly zones to implement its resolutions, the decisions that it makes. Any country can, of course, ignore what the UN says, but it will ignore it at its peril. both its peril in terms of having those implementing enforcement powers against it, but also the diplomatic, the trade, all of the other bilateral in between states that will occur. So countries might turn around and boycott a country that ignores the UN Security Council resolution. We saw this in terms of Iraq. We saw this in terms of Yugoslavia, Rwanda. So if Israel does ignore this resolution, it will do so to its detriment. The problem is that Israel's adversary in this is a terrorist group. And the terrorist group will ignore anything that's tabled at the United Nations because it's not a sovereign state and because it doesn't care what the global community says so long as it continues to be funded by Iran or by other countries that support its aims. So what the United States said after the vote was really crucial. It said that all countries at the Security Council must use their power to put pressure on Hamas to actually abide by the terms of this resolution and specifically to hold to the ceasefire and specifically to release the hostages, dead or alive, of whatever age and of whatever ability.
OK, so Israel has indicated that it will carry on regardless. But it, as you say, it has cover in this in as much as a state, we can say, yes, you must do this, but Israel can turn around and say, well, what about them? What about Hamas? Are you going to punish them if you punish us?
Well, the ceasefire will hold for as long as both parties adhere to it. So the minute that one party breaks it, the other party will point and say, well, they broke it. They fired a rocket into Israel or they carried on incursions into Rafah, and they will use that as an excuse. More importantly, perhaps, is that the United States and others of Israel's allies hold the key to the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome prevents rockets from falling down and killing many, if not most, of Israelis. And those rockets aren't only coming from Gaza, they're also coming from Lebanon, from Hezbollah, which is another terrorist organization which is funded by Iran. If Israel doesn't abide to the terms of this resolution, and if its allies then don't continue to fund the Iron Dome, then this could be a very significant moment for the continuation of the State of Israel.
Thank you for walking us through that so clearly, Professor. Professor Rosa Freedman from the University of Reading in the UK.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring in Aaron David Miller, who's a Middle East analyst and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He previously worked at the US State Department for 24 years, serving 6 secretaries of state as an advisor on the Middle East. Welcome to DW. Will this ceasefire resolution prevent Israel from continuing its plans to go into Gaza?
Look, this resolution is certainly not shameful, as the Israeli rep described it, but it's also not very effective. It's going to change nothing on the ground. And the reality is today was not, in my judgment, was not a good day either for the United States or Israel. We had a UN Security Council resolution that essentially cannot affect and advance what the president really wants, which is to fundamentally see a de-escalation in Gaza, cessation in Israel's military activities, freeing the hostages, and surging humanitarian assistance that's so desperately needed by 2.3 million Gazans who are essentially besieged. This resolution will accomplish none of that. And Israel's response to this resolution, which was to politic, the prime minister has already begun his re-election campaign, to criticize the United States and refuse to send a delegation to discuss whether there are alternatives to ground campaign in Rafah. That was also fundamentally counterproductive. Neither what the U.S. did today or what Israel did today is going to alter one iota of the conflict that we're watching and has been ongoing for 6 months. The only thing that will do that is an Israeli-Hamas negotiation, which produces a 6-week pause, which might create the time and space to fundamentally change and alter the dynamics in Gaza. But today won't do it, either what the U.S. did or what Israel did.
So from the analysis that you've just given us here, you seem to be saying that the UN is really irrelevant to what's going on the ground.
The UN can do a lot. It has agencies and expertise with respect to humanitarian assistance. And in the Middle East, it's demonstrated a penchant for peacekeeping and other conflict areas.
But in terms of a ceasefire, you think it has...
It cannot alter the behavior of the two major combatants to this conflict. And the reason it's going on for 6 months is because no outside power is willing and or able to fundamentally change the battlefield dynamic between what Israel wants and what Hamas seeks to achieve. That should be apparent to everyone.
Right. So do you think then, so given everything that you said, and you talked about Benjamin Netanyahu essentially politicking now on re-election, everyone, the Israelis get stuck in their silo, the US doesn't change its position until and unless there's President Biden is removed. Those two dynamics don't change. This sounds like, unless something major happens, perhaps militarily, everybody stays where they are.
I think, frankly, the only party or parties, plural, that seem to be in a hurry to end the conflict between Israel and Hamas, certainly not Israel, and it's certainly not Hamas. The parties that are displaying the greatest sense of urgency, and it's politically inconvenient to recognize, are the parties that are external to these conflicts. I've been around Middle East negotiations for a very long time. They tend to have two speeds, slow and slower. And in order for them to succeed, each side needs to have urgency and an achievable goal that will somehow fundamentally address their concerns. I see no way right now to do any better than a 6-week pause. Hamas wants to survive. They'll keep 50 hostages, even if 45 are released. The Israelis are determined to obliterate Hamas as a military organization and to kill its senior leadership. I don't think either side has abandoned those goals. And in view of that, whether it's Germany or the UN or the US, nobody is willing and or able to fundamentally alter the calculations of the two combatants. That's why this conflict's gone on for 6 months.
That's clear. Help us understand Washington's thinking. What was it about this resolution that made them not use the veto, which they have used 3 times against similar resolutions?
It's a very good question. I think on one hand, there's a certain exhaustion of having to somehow fundamentally try to alter or veto 4 UN Security Council resolutions. I think the United States wanted to send a signal. It sent a signal, there's no question about it, that it's very unhappy, that it may even be angry at the current government of Israel and some of its policies. I think political pressure is building. Mainstream Democrats, the so-called uncommitted, in a very close election, which could be determined by 3 or 4 states under 100,000 votes in November. The uncommitted, those who, for any number of reasons, including the administration's policy on Gaza, may choose simply not to vote. So I think all of these things combine, but the ultimate objective is having the opposite effect. That's the problem. It's not advancing what Joe Biden wants. And the only thing that can deliver that, which is to literally change the pictures in Gaza, break the battlefield dynamic, create predictable corridors to surge humanitarian assistance, and maybe, just maybe, after a 6-week pause, try to extend that somehow. The only thing that's going to do that is what's happening in Doha. Nothing in New York or at the UN can bring that about.
Okay, that's a fascinating, very interesting and rather bleak analysis, but we thank you for it. Aaron David Miller at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.